Hello, bonjour, namaste. Welcome to the Canada and India show, where we meet the people that make up the vibrant Canada-India relationship. Every week, we interview leaders in their fields to dive into who they are and what drives them. From the arts, to trade, to human rights, we will discover together how rich and diverse this relationship really is.
Could you live in a wooden skyscraper? I'm Annie Dubé, Canada's Consul General in Mumbai, India. And in this episode of the Canada in India show, I'm talking with Michael Green, founder and principal architect at MGA based in Vancouver. He was recently in Mumbai to attend a design conference. Michael is a strong advocate for climate change and has addressed this topic in a TED Talk titled, Why We Should Build Wooden Skyscrapers, something you'll hear more about in just a little bit. Michael has also authored 2 books, and his firm has received several awards, including 2 Governor General's medals in Canada, which is very prestigious. He and I talked about design, climate change, and the power of building a diverse team. You're a strong advocate for the use of wood in construction. Can you share with us why is wood your material of choice?
Sure. Maybe I can talk about first the reason I came to Mumbai for a very exciting architectural conference, one of the most important on the continent, really, and certainly in India, and it's called the 361 Conference. It was a wonderful event with this year's theme being speaking about the future. Where are we going as architects? And there were architects from around the world and many architects from India that spoke about their vision of the future. So my contribution was to talk about wood and to talk about why I think wood is actually a fundamental solution to a lot of the problems we're facing moving forward in the world. And so those 2 problems that I see that architects need to address are the first being climate change issues, and the second being affordability and the increased need to house the world and provide solutions for building for the world. With climate change, what's important for people to learn and understand is that buildings represent globally between 30 and 40% of man's greenhouse gas emissions come from the making and the operating of buildings. In North America, the number is even higher. It's about 50% of man's greenhouse gas footprint. Cars in North America are only 27%. So a lot of the time we think it's one thing, it's actually buildings. And so architects have a very major role in finding a solution to solve the problem. Steel and concrete are the main materials we build our cities in. And those are both wonderful materials, but they're also materials that require a huge amount of energy to make and therefore actually produce a large carbon footprint. Wood, as an alternative material to compete with steel and concrete, actually is a material that's grown by the power of the sun. It's a renewable material, obviously. And most importantly, it actually absorbs carbon dioxide, which is important in the forest. That's one of the ways the earth actually counteracts carbon dioxide emissions, is to soak up into the forest. But if you use a tree, and of course replant trees afterwards, if you use a tree in a building or a piece of furniture, it's actually storing the carbon dioxide into the building or that piece of furniture. That's an essential solution. There are really 2 solutions to solving climate impact. One is to reduce emissions. The second is to store carbon. And wood is the only major building material that does both those 2 things. And so that's the first challenge of why wood is important. The second challenge is the fact that if people are, population is growing globally, people are becoming thankfully more wealthy and are able to afford homes. And at the same time, people are moving at an incredibly fast rate into cities. And so today the world is over half the world lives in cities. We expect that to grow to 70% in the next 20 years, 30 years. And that means we have to really think about buildings being much bigger, people living more densely, new types of buildings. Traditionally, that means steel and concrete buildings. If we build, though, because of the explanation I gave on climate change and steel and concrete, it means we're on a collision course with history that could dramatically impact our lives and the future of the planet. We can't continue to build the way we have been and at the same time meet the human need for a lot more housing. 2 billion people in the world will need a new house in the next 15 years. That's a lot of buildings. If we do it the way we were, obviously we're in trouble. So wood is the solution. That's the root of the mission and the conversation. And we've developed ways to build wood buildings in urban environments that are much bigger. And that's the exciting change that's happened in the construction industry that's just beginning. And it means actually skyscrapers made of wood, which is the theme of a lot of the work that we've been talking about in Canada.
It's your third time in India, and I'm very curious about your impression on how we can use wood for the betterment of cities here.
So, one of the amazing things in India, of course, is it has an enormous population. It's increasing its wealth as a country. It means that there's population that's moving into cities. There's population that are increasingly in need of homes, but also that can afford homes and can move. There'll be an enormous amount of building. And really, India and China, given their populations, are the two countries in the world that have to lead this charge. And so what I'm hoping is that Indian architects, that Indian contractors, that Indian developers take hold of this change and recognize their global leadership role in developing an industry here that solves the problem and uses more wood as part of that solution. So I really do expect this to become a very important part of the Indian building culture over the next 10, 20 years. What's surprising is how fast this movement is happening globally. So when we first introduced these concepts, and I wrote this book called The Case for Tall Wood Buildings, Why We Should Do This, it was only 10 years ago we wrote the book. But now building codes around the world, in Canada, the United States, and China, have moved from thinking of wood buildings being small to actually embracing the idea that you can build them very large, very tall. You can do it safely for fire. You can do it safely for structure. You can do it safely in earthquakes, and that it actually is an important part of public policy now in many countries as part of addressing climate agenda issues.
You have mentioned also that wood buildings are going higher and higher. What are the current acceptable norms, and where can we aim in terms of height?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing is that, and this may surprise the listeners, is that we have now got the current world's tallest wood buildings in Vancouver, and it's 18 stories tall. But we're currently designing projects upwards of 30, 35 stories tall in wood. And we technically know that we could build buildings as much as 100 stories in wood. Now, I'm not sure personally, as an architect, that the world should have a whole bunch of 100-story towers. There's a point where big buildings are harder to live in. But I think what happens when we push a building really tall to solve it from an engineering point of view is that it opens up the public's imagination and it creates greater acceptance for the idea of big wood buildings that may actually end up being mostly 12 stories, 16 stories, 18 stories, which, for wood is a really achievable and appropriate scale.
And to achieve that, you are working on developing some training online so that people can understand the best practices and how to optimize the use of wood. Do you want to tell us more about your, your project?
Yeah. So, my architecture firm does buildings. We do them all around the world, and we love to design for our clients. And they're great. Each time we do a building, we try to innovate and use it as a tool to show how the world might build more buildings of its type. And that mission to propagate the story of why we believe in these buildings also comes with that of responsibility to make sure that as architects, designers, contractors, people that write public policy understand the issues. We felt like we needed to create a school that was not just local in Canada, but that was a really global program. There's a limited number of experts around the world that know how to do these kinds of buildings, but there's a huge interest in learning how. And so by using an online platform, and we call it Timber Online Education, or short form TOE, which is kind of a funny name, but Timber Online Education, it means that people will be able to access in a broad range of programs, courses that are both very short, sometimes 3 minutes, or very long, sometimes like an intensive engineering course of an hour, to get the knowledge to make sure that as they do it within their own country, they're doing it with the best practices based on a sort of collaborative knowledge that's growing around the world, and makes the conversation much less siloed. That the history of building has been that we each, roughly remain in our own culture, in our own building culture, in our own countries. This requires a global solution. This is a global problem we're facing. It has to become a global solution, and our platform of teaching will allow that. What's really exciting, I think, is that we want to provide it for free. We want to provide it in many different languages. And rather than it being a teacher in front of a classroom. It can be a little hard to listen to. We want to make it actually a very engaging, entertaining platform where, depending on the language, your own native language, when you watch it, you feel like the course was actually created in your own language. And we think that will help it be much more successful in educating the world, both from young people, university-age people, practicing professionals, and especially governments and policymakers that need to encourage this new way of thinking.
Canada is leading the way in making sure that wood, a sustainable product, is making its way into taller building in redesigning the cities as we know them. You've mentioned that you've been talking to a lot of people. You were in a conference here in Mumbai. How is the acceptance so far, and how do you see this moving forward in terms of next steps?
So it's funny, when I started this conversation publicly, it was really only 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was told by many, many people, many of my colleagues, this will never happen. You can't change the construction industry. It's a huge ship that doesn't turn very quickly. And to my great pleasure and surprise, this has happened very quickly, that architects around the world have embraced the idea. Universities are teaching the idea. There's this huge hunger to solve this problem. And this is a critical part of the solution. And so it's happening faster than I could imagine. And it's happening organically because the internet allows knowledge to be shared in such a broad way. And what that's meant is actually, I think, it's the sort of timing of things like the Paris Accord and governments awakening to where are the solutions that are both practical and affordable. And this is an affordable solution of addressing climate change. It's meant that governments have embraced the change, and that means that building codes have changed, and that means this is becoming increasingly real, possible, and happening fast. So, Canada's changed their building code to allow 20-story tall wood buildings. The United States just only 2 weeks ago announced that their code will change to allow 18-story wood buildings. China is allowing 18-story wood buildings. These numbers of height, truthfully, are relatively arbitrary, but they're clearly broadening the imagination of what's possible. And I think we'll see code change in India without question, and we'll see it happen in other countries. I think, as Canadians, our job, because we've been at the forefront of this conversation, is to share this information at all levels, from government and support on building code change that can come from, the Canadian code officials to the Indian code officials to architects being able to share their knowledge back and forth. Being here and meeting with Indian architects has been really exciting because I can see the enthusiasm that they have. I met some people here already really engaged in the conversation, some companies here already interested in building in wood, and companies that really want to grow this opportunity as both a native Indian idea as well as one that they collaborate with Canada and Canadian wood products.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us on the show. It was very great to hear from you.
No problem. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't miss next week's episode where I talk with Manjeet Kripalani, co-founder and executive director of Gateway House, a think tank on foreign policy based in Mumbai. We talk about the Indo-Canadian initiative called Track 1.5, India's foreign policy, and its role in the G20.
We are thrilled that you shared this time with us today. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on our social media channels. On Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we are at Canada in India. You can listen to all our episodes wherever you get your podcasts, so please do subscribe. Thank you. Merci. Dhanyavad.